In the words of few great men, education is the progressive discovery of our ignorance. It is an ornament in prosperity and a refuge in adversity. A balmy evening to one and all present here. On this eve of the inauguration of Tarkashastra, logically speaking, the second edition of the National Moot Court Competition at our esteemed institution, I extend a very warm welcome to the dignitaries on the dais, the Honorable Chief Guest of the day, the renowned thought leader, Shri S. Gurumurthy, Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam, Dean Planning and Development, Dr. P. Ravishekar Raju, Head of the Department, School of Law, Ms. Kripa Ramachandran, Student Convener of Tarkashastra 2013, our beloved Vice Chancellor, revered Registrar and other deans, revered faculty members, beloved participants from various law schools across the country, guests and my fellow students. The art and science of Tarka or logic eternally prevails as the strongest weapon wielded by a lawyer blessed with the gift of the gab. At Tarkashastra, logically speaking, the School of Law through the Shastra Moot Court Society brings to you the ultimate test of truth in the battlefield of logic and law. I once again welcome one and all present here to Tarkashastra 2013 at Shastra University. I request you all to solicitously rise for the official prayer hymn rendered by Mr. Anantharaman.
मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृजेत्री मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृजेत्री आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत युद्धं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत युद्धं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत त्यजत परेष्वक्रममाक्रमणम् त्यजत परेष्वक्रममाक्रमणम् मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृजेत्रीं जननी पृथिवी कामदुगास्ते जननी पृथिवी कामदुगास्ते जनको देवः सकलदयालु जनको देवः सकलदयालु धाम्यत दत्त दयत्वं जनत धाम्यत दत्त दयत्वं जनत श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां.
I now invite Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam, Dean Planning and Development, to deliver the welcome address and set the context for today's lecture.
Very distinguished speaker for this inaugural function of Tarkashastra, faculty colleagues, student friends from both the School of Law at Shastra University, as well as participants from other law schools from all over the country. A very good evening to all of you. I'm extremely happy that the School of Law has chosen me to deliver the welcome address, and they know when Mr. Gurumurthy is here, I have the exclusive right to deliver the welcome address. It's all about rights, School of Law. And I'm happy because what awaits you this evening is an intellectual cocktail. You see, 10 days back, the climate in Delhi was so uncertain. The political establishment was very shaky. It was so mercurial. that all of those who watched the, I call it the argument industry in the television channels, everybody talking about it, and those defending the present government said the government is neither lame nor duck. But then Derek O'Brien said, that's why I am surprised. How was that? It is neither lame nor duck, but still lame duck. So when the organizers said you'll have to propose the welcome address, I applied the same logic with a counter intuition. So I thought I will confess to begin with that I am neither a lawyer nor a student of law nor a sociologist, but counterintuitively from the lame duck analogy, I said, okay, I will also set the context for this inaugural function of Tarka Shastra, which is going to be a talk on the evolution of law and society. But that doesn't mean that if you're a lawyer and a sociologist, you can talk about the evolution of law and society. The topic is so multidimensional that we need people who are so intellectually diverse, persons whose profundity in their thoughts make them thought leaders, persons whose integrity with the numbers make them successful chartered accountant, a person who's intimate with the economic development of nations, making him an expert economist, a person with a penchant for details, making him a journalist par excellence, a person whose mastery over commerce, business and trade make him one of the most sought after corporate consultants, a person whose unique understanding of the society and the way in which humans behave make him a natural anthropologist and sociologist himself, and above all, brilliance in the legal domain make him one of the leading criminal and corporate lawyers who hasn't practiced at the bar. If I should borrow P.C. Alexander's statement when he said, Nani Palkiwala was the best finance minister that India never had. Ladies and gentlemen, I am talking about Mr. S. Gurumurthy, the polymathic intellect who has agreed to deliver this inaugural address on the topic evolution of law and society. Please join me in welcoming Shri S. Gurumurthy to the stand. You see, though I am not a lawyer nor a sociologist, I always take pride in being a mainstream member of the functional society in our country. And that is why I thought with that singular eligibility, I will set the context for this inaugural address. My view could be right or wrong, but then this is my personal view. I have a feeling that the contemporary Indian law has supplanted the traditional law. Traditional law so much that natural law is today being replaced by modern law. And I don't have anything against modernity per se, but the discourse by the marginal deviance in the society, and that discourse in the name of progressive jurisprudence is setting the direction for modern law. That makes the issue very concerning for me. And I will leave with just 3 points for you to think, to make my statement, my opinion good. First thing is about the law on the same-sex marriage. All of you know the Delhi High Court order, so celebrated by the media, by the policy makers when they interpreted the section 377. They said the time has come that modernity has displaced the traditional law. But how many of you know that the 377 was not the creation of our Manu Shastra? It was the creation of the Machiavellian Shastra. I call it the Machiavellian Tantra Shastra. But then, as law students, I do not know how many of you know that it was not the creation of the Manu Shastra. And there was no reason to celebrate this order and to hold it symbolically as the one that is displacing traditional law. In fact, the Supreme Court in the US, just as we talk, they are now discussing the constitutionality of this same-sex marriage, and the judges today are deferring the hearing proceedings itself. They say that it is impossible to arrive at a conclusion based on facts and data that has been gathered in the last 5 or 10 years and try to interpret a civilizational asset that has endured 2000 years. So they themselves are deferring this entire hearing proceedings. So this is the state of this particular law in the most advanced contemporary jurisprudence. The second point is the intervention of the society in the dispensation of justice. You know what happened in Delhi in December. Very unfortunate, very barbaric. And the society got together. And then it turned out that to pacify the society, the Justice Verma committee was appointed, and then you read in the newspaper that an act is going to be put in place. But is an act a solution? The latest dispatch of India Today, Mr. Arun Shourie, brilliantly has written an article. What is the use of enacting acts when there is no action? Did right to education guarantee knowledge? Did right to life guarantee livelihood? Or is your right to food going to guarantee you nutrition? There is no point in having acts when there is no action. He said, if 30,000 rape cases are pending in our country, and after this unfortunate Delhi incident, if the government had taken the stand that within 6 months it would dispense of all the 30,000 cases, then that is action, and that would have pacified the society. And if that was the stand that the government had taken, we wouldn't have people like Justice Kajju flaunting, Article 72 and 161 in the name of pardoning in the recent case of Sanjay Dutt. Things should happen in a reasonable time frame before people use that loophole. And this partisan intervention of the society in selectively choosing certain cases and disposing them contrary to established provisions in law is another issue that intermediates the relationship between society and law. The third thing is the role of IPC in the holy institution of marriage. You cannot imagine a criminal code trying to strike a balance in the matrimonial court. Not possible at all. In the same Supreme Court hearing in the United States, they said it is beyond their imagination to step into the sociological and moral minefield of this holy institution of marriage, and they just don't want to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we are at a time where the richness in our legal system, the Indian legal system, is so plural. It covers a wide spectrum. You have judicial dispensation right at the Nyaya Panchayats level, and on this end right up to the Supreme Court level. But you are products of the best law schools that give you legal education in English, and what strikes you is those orders that you see delivered in various high courts or Supreme Courts, that you have access through all the libraries, online and in print form, and you have no clue what is happening at the other levels of judicial dispensation in our country. And I have a feeling that it is legal populism that is actually overriding the genuine legal pluralism in our country. And sir, today's audience is not just students of Shastra. They are students from many other law schools. And I am confused today, I honestly admit that. And I am concerned that this set of students who are going to charter the legal contours of our country for the future should not be confused. Because law as a subject is not an individual subject by itself. And you will listen to Mr. S. Gurumurthy when he tries to intermediate so many different domains and interlink with law. Then you will understand what I am trying to say. It is the relationship between various stakeholders, the aggregation of various stakeholders that influence the legal setup, the legal architecture of any country. And I urge you, students, to carefully listen to Mr. S. Gurumurthy and even make notes if necessary, because this is one of the rarest of speeches. In fact, I am listening to him for the first time on this topic. And that makes even my expectation very unique in the sense that I have always admired Mr. Gurumurthy, and we have shared a number of ideas and we have almost agreed in almost all of them. And this is one topic that I am eagerly looking forward to, listening to from his master's voice. With this backdrop, I welcome all of you, and I am sure that the next 3 days that you are here, you also get exposure to as much as possible to the legal richness that is available in the School of Law at Shastra University. I welcome all of you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I invite Dr. P. Ravishekar Raju, the head of the Department, School of Law, to present a memento to our chief guest, Shri S. Gurumurthy, as a token of our gratitude and appreciation for his august presence. Thank you, sir. I now invite the Honorable Chief Guest, Shri S. Gurumurthy, to give an auspicious start to Tarkashastra 2013 by lighting the Kuttuvilakku. Our Honorable Chief Guest of the Day and renowned thought leader, Shri S. Gurumurthy, to deliver the inaugural address and enlighten all of us assembled here on the evolution of law in society.
Friends, I owe it to my respect and reverence for your Vice Chancellor, Mr. Sethurama, for frequenting Shastra, because this institution aligns with my overall attitude to life of combining values and honesty, which is a very difficult task, and particularly in the field of education. So, when I am coming here, I come with this thought that I am delivering my thoughts to an institution which is a vehicle to transform these thoughts into action, as my friend Vaidya Subramaniam said. Dignitaries on the dais, faculty members, law students from different law schools. Vaidya Subramaniam subtly mentioned that I am no lawyer. In fact, I suffer from a very serious identity crisis, because I happen to write. I am seen as a writer by my own profession, chartered accountants. They think I am a journalist. And the journalists think I am a chartered accountant. They don't think I am a journalist. Chartered accountants don't think I am a chartered accountant. And of course, lawyers are not going to agree, I know law. But actually, law has been my passion in life. In my corporate life, corporate consultancy, my clients trust me more for my knowledge of law than for my knowledge of accounts. So if there is anything which enables me, which qualifies me to stand before the budding law students, lawyers, jurists, to talk about the subject which has been handed to me by Ved Subramaniam, about law and society, it is this, that I am a very passionate student of law. This is one subject apart from spirituality which attracts me. Now, when we talk about law, we are not going to talk in a vacuum. We are going to talk in the context of India, Indian judicial system, and generally about India. Why I am putting this as the preface is my experience with high educational institutions, like even the IIT, where I found the knowledge of India is almost absent in high educational institutions like IIT also. When I happened to deliver a lecture in 2010 in IIT Bombay, ahead of me spoke one industrialist, a very reputed industrialist by name Adi Godrej. All of you must have heard his name. And he made a very popular statement which is accepted by all. In the profane domain, in the public domain, newspaper, media, the statement that India was always a country of poverty, hunger, illiteracy, backwardness. And we began tasting prosperity only after globalization came into being. Normally accepted. And when he spoke, the entire research faculty, faculties of IIR, students, all of them stood up and clapped. But what surprised me was that is not the truth. I can understand ordinary people reading newspapers who have not gone deep into the history, economic history of the world and India, believing that India was no great performer in economics. But when the top intellectual institution, which is going to be window to the world and a world to India, when in such an institution you find this kind of illiteracy, I was surprised. I kept aside all the notes which I had taken to talk to the students, and then began talking about the history of economics. You know what Mr. Godrej spoke about Indian economic history is 30 years old. It was a colonial presentation to Indians that you are no good. You are fit to be only slaves. So we have come to rule you. And so you have to listen to us. You have to be ruled by us. This colonial education had settled in our mind that we are an inferior race, and we have always been an inferior race. And I was shocked because global researchers, not research in India, global researchers have established from 1983 onwards that India was not only a global power, but it was the leading global power for 1700 years, from the first year of Common Era to 1750 actually. Only in one century, 1600, China overtook India. Otherwise, India was always the leading economic engine of the world with more than a third of the world's production. And in 1750, the share of America in global GDP was 0.1%. And that of England, 1.8%. This is the research done by Paul Bairoch, a Belgian economist who created a scare among the Western policy makers in 1983 that we were no great producers of prosperity. It was Asia, India, China which was producing prosperity. Our standard of living was not that good till as late as 1800, 1850. And this research was later confirmed by the OECD countries, the richest countries in the world, which constituted Development Institute studies under Angus Madison. Give him a platoon of law, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, statisticians, historians, and he came out with a magnum opus. Economic history of the world, a millennial perspective. And he said in 2000 years, for 1700 years, India was the leading economic engine of the world. When I completed this speech, the IIT professors, lecturers, students, all of them came and surrounded me. Sir, we know nothing about this. When they say they know nothing about this, they say they know nothing about India. And they said, don't stop with this lecture. Please run a course for us. And I am actually doing a quarterly course for them. Actually, I am running a course. Tomorrow I will be teaching them this. 10 weeks I run a course every year. Why I am mentioning this is, I want to open your mind. First to think that our knowledge of our country, our tradition, our civilization, our culture, our politics, our law, our scheme of things, our worldview, our society is limited. And this education system does not enlighten you on this. That's what I am going to say when we talk about law and society. You know, lawyers have been all over the world, not only in India. All over the world, the legal profession has been the intellectual leaders of the world. And in India, the freedom movement was led by largely lawyers, whether it is Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru or take anybody. They were the leading light, thinking for the society, for the country, for future. Now, of course, lawyers are made to think only about themselves, their client, their fees, the judges. So you must understand that there is a dwarfing of the profession from that which should lead to the country, to which that looks after only its balance sheet. So now you have got to move away from your professional narrowness to understand what law really means, how law evolved, the law which we are constitutional law or criminal law or civil law or public law, other public law, how all this evolved. In fact, there was a case which went to the Supreme Court about what is the position of the governor or the president. It was Samsher Singh's case. Many of you may have read that case. In which Justice Krishna Iyer said, what is the Constitution of India? He put it with a riverine imagery, not the Potomac, but the Thames which fertilizes the flow of the Yamuna. Many people did not understand what he was saying. He says Potomac is the American river, Thames is the English river, Yamuna is the Indian river. See, our legal system, which is similar to, a simile he uses was Yamuna, is fertilized by Thames and not by Potomac, which means we follow the British system of jurisprudence and not the American system of jurisprudence. Krishna Iyer is always known for his convoluted English. But what is absent in this is Ganga, you must understand. Potomac is there, Thames is there, Ganga is not. So the question that arises in our mind, you read any commentary on the Indian Constitution, the making of the Indian Constitution, the preface to the Indian Constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates and the comments on the working of the Indian Constitution, you will find the content of India in the Constitution of India is very limited. So what is the Indian content in the Indian Constitution? I am not taking it to a chauvinistic discussion. I am going to make a logical presentation to you as to how a law evolved elsewhere in the world, constitutional law, and how it evolved in India. If you look at the entire Indian constitution, the central player in the Indian constitution is the individual. If you look at the original constitution, they said part 3 of the constitution can never be amended. What is the part 3 of the constitution? Fundamental rights. The entire fundamental rights is dedicated to the individual. Except Article 29-30, which constitute community rights. I will come to you a little later about it. So individual is the most critical player. The entire constitution rests on the individual and the state. There is nothing in between. So how did this come about? There is something called the family. There is something called community. There is something called society. How is it that the entire range of very practical institutions which work in our life is not there in the constitution? And we set out to say we will form a casteless society and a classless society. This was the resolution of the ruling party, opposition parties. This you could find in the declaration of ministers, parliament, president's addresses. You will say we will produce a casteless society and a classless society. But I don't think anyone repeats it today because our polity has become founded on caste. In the clash between the Constitution of India and caste, caste has won. This is not something to worry about. An intellectual will think how it happened. An intellectual will not worry. An intellectual will go into a scientific expedition into how did this happen. All top leaders of the country were working to destroy caste. It has not been destroyed. It has not only not been destroyed, it has emerged as successful. It has not only emerged as successful, it has been accepted. Now everybody accepts it in politics. So, that which is not a player, that which was merely tolerated for purpose of reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, then the backward class entered the Constitution of India, reservations. I am not finding fault with any of these things, I am just analyzing. I am not for a moment saying it is right or wrong, it may even be right or it may be wrong. But a merciless analysis of how the constitution which set out to say that India is a collection of only individuals, individual rights can never be affected by the state. The state can't do anything about it. And the state will be elected by the individuals through the electoral system and the state will do the rest. Nothing else matters. In this we see a whole lot of intermediary institutions exercising very powerful influence on the state, not the individual. So, what is wrong with the Indian Constitution in accepting the individual as the fundamental? Is it correct? This inquiry is a very important inquiry which can never be delayed hereafter. Anyone who wants to find the sustainability of the Indian Constitution legal system will have to make a very deep, merciless, unbiased inquiry into how the individual became the central player in the Indian scheme of things in the Constitution, while it is not so in the society. The society does not regard individual as that important. The society regards many other things as important, which the Constitution does not recognize at all. If you have to answer this question, how the Indian Constitution come to look at the individual as the most important thing and no other intermediary institution was regarded as worthy of recognition, you have got to go back and understand what was the inspiration, what was the origin, what was the historical source of the Indian Constitution. Generally, the lawyers say the Indian Constitution is nothing but the Government of India Act of 1935 plus the Bill of Rights. Government of India Act of 1935 was the donation of the British colonial system, and the Bill of Rights was the evolution of the American legislative system. So, if you put these two things together, more or less it means the substance of the Indian Constitution. But if you want to understand why the Indian Constitution evolved like this with the individual as the center, you have got to go to the origin of the idea of state. You know, the state in the West evolved because of two reasons. There was no concept of state. Many people think that the nation state in the West has been there for thousands of years. Eric Hobsbawm, who is supposed to be the authoritative scholar, historian on the history of evolution of nation state, says the present nation state which you see in Europe, whether it is Germany, France, Italy, England, this is an evolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. Before that, there was nothing called nation state at all. When France was formed, only 2% of the people knew the French language. When Italy was formed, less than 2% of the people knew the Italian language which is spoken today. It is thus very powerful person joined together and declared this a state. That's how these states were created. In fact, I want to read out to you what Henry Kissinger says in his book Diplomacy about how the state evolved. There was to be nothing called a state. There was only something called a universal state. Kissinger writes, when historians describe today as the European balance of power system emerged in the 17th century and the final collapse of the medieval aspiration to universality, a concept of world order that represented the blending of the traditions of the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. The world was considered to be mirroring the heavens. Just as one God ruled heaven, so one emperor will rule over the secular world and one pope would rule over the universal church. This was the idea of state, one universal state. He adds, in Western Europe, the potential and from time to time actual conflict between Pope and the Emperor established a condition for eventual constitutionalism. You must mark this word. The idea that we must become independent of the Roman Empire was the origin of states, nation states and constitutionalism. For eventual constitutionalism and separation of powers, which are the basis of modern democracy, it enabled the various feudal leaders to enhance their autonomy by exacting a price from contending parties. This in turn led to a fractional Europe, a patchwork of duchies, counties, cities, and bishoprics. Though in theory all feudal lords owed fealty to the empire, in practice they did what they pleased. Various dynasties claimed imperial crown and central authority almost disappeared. This was the beginning of the formation of the nation states in Europe. Eric Hobsbawm says the idea of nation preceded the concept of state. That is true of India actually. We did not have one state, but we had one nation. So basically, it is the historical process which was very closely associated with the theological developments of the church, which led to the concept of state and what should be the character of the state. So the earliest person who conceived a theory of the state, we must know what is the theory of the state. I don't know whether law schools teach about Hobbes, who wrote that 4-volume Leviathan. He said that without a central authority, there will be chaos. And so the central authority has to be created, and the central authority should have unlimited authority. And this, he said, is possible only by what is known as social contract. That all the people have agreed to hand over their rights and lives to the state in exchange for the state protecting them. This is what was the origin of the state. This is without consent, that I hand over my authority, my powers to you, that you need not do it. They have taken over the authority. This is without consent. This is almost a monarchy, a dictatorship. Then Locke's, it is 1651 was Hobbes. Then 1689 was Locke's. He said no. People cannot be brought into contract without their consent. Their consent is also needed. So elements of democracy got ordered in theory. It is not that democracy came into being. Democracy came into being much later. The thought about democracy came into being that people all contract to live together, that all the people in India will be one state and we elect one government and that government will rule us. And we have handed over all the rights and liberty of us to the government, and it is their responsibility to protect our lives and liberty. This was the origin of the state in the West. And then Rousseau came in 1762 and said it is not possible for people to give their consent. But if there is a popular leader, a popular king, he is supposed to have the tacit consent of all. So from a state without consent to a state with consent, he bridged the gap by making it that there could be a state which formed with the tacit consent of the people, provided the king is a popular king and everybody accepts him. This was the origin. From this, everything came. The king can do no wrong. The social contract theory means I surrender my personal rights, my right to life, my right to property, my right to speech. Everything is surrendered to the state, and state grants these rights, and it can suspend these rights also. This is very, very important. You know, the right to suspend the rights of the people is the sovereign right which was considered to be inalienable for a state which has to rule. There is nothing called natural rights. The right to life, which is supposed to be natural right, under social contract theory, it becomes the grant of the state. The state gives you the right to live. It can suspend the right also. This is not in theory. In the year 1975, when the government of India declared emergency, why I say you must know this, I am going to tell you how practical it is. When the government of India declared emergency and the fundamental rights were suspended, and people were arrested without any warrant. Some people were killed. One Rajan was killed, and a road roller was run over him, and not even a bit of his flesh was available. No police officer was responsible. And people were thrown in jail, people disappeared. So 10 high courts said this is wrong, this cannot be done. Because you may suspend the constitution, but there is natural right in the people to live. You can't stop that natural life right by saying constitution has come into being and so your natural right is gone. The case came to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of India shamed itself by giving a verdict which said there is no right outside the Constitution of India, because under the social contract theory under which our constitution has been framed, this is the philosophy under which our constitution has been framed, which says that the people have surrendered their rights to the government. And it is the grant of that rights which makes you enjoy freedom of speech, which makes you enjoy your property, and which gives you the right to live and liberty. And once the government has lawfully suspended this, constitutionally suspended this, under the contract which you have entered into with the government, with the state, then you have no right to live. You know, this was the judgment given by the Supreme Court of India. And this was based on a philosophy which evolved in Europe. This is important. This is the European experience, that philosophy, that structure, the social work, and you must know how it evolved. It is not that a thought evolved and a great thinker expounded this without a social process. A social process made the thinkers to conceive of this model, because there was chaos all around. And only local tribal leaders, chieftains, and with enormous amount of violence. You must go through two websites. One, religiostolerance.com, and another, I'll tell you later, that is another website. If you go through this website, you will find in the last 2000 years, 1 billion people have been killed by state action. 1 billion people. Nil in India till the Muslim invasion. Nil in India till the Muslim invasion. State action never killed people in India. This is something which history has recorded. And with this, a society which could not be controlled had to be controlled by very, very powerful persons ruling over them, and without that they can't live, because there is no method of living, there is no norm for living, there is no value for living with each other in peace. There is no overarching philosophy for people to live together without the state. The state becomes the primary instrument to see that there is order in the society. The state becomes the principal player. So this is the philosophy which Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, they expounded. That the state becomes so central. And how the individual came later, I am going to tell you. First, the state became the principal player. And I said the emergency argument in India was based on the philosophy of state in Europe. That the state is the grantor of the right to live also. Which is not an Indian concept. Which is not our tradition. And then there are two aspects which I want to mention before I go into the social aspect. You must all have heard about Karl Marx. Karl Marx said the state has become such an oppressive instrument of the powerful people lording over the ordinary people. The ordinary people have to capture the state. And that is what he called the proletarian revolution. We should take over the state and destroy the state, and we should become stateless. This is the ideal state. He followed a philosopher by name Hegel, and it involves lot of clashes. He said that it is thesis, antithesis and synthesis. This will keep on happening. This struggle will ultimately result in an ideal state, and that is statelessness. This is what Karl Marx said. Mahabharata says exactly the reverse. It says, Naivarajyam narajasim nadando nachadandidaka dharmaneva praja sarvam rakshantisma parasparam. He said there was a time when there was no law, there was no king, there was no law enforcer, there was nobody to be punished. The people were looking after each other and they knew what was right and what was wrong. This was the state in which this society was. But he said as people began to develop desires, the strong began to tread on the toes of the weak, and to protect the weak, enlightened people conceived of a limited state. You can understand from statelessness we moved into a limited state. The concept is the people should have the freedom to live without a state. That is the idea. Karl Marx said we will move from a powerful state to statelessness. We said no. You cannot move from the practical to the ideal. You have to move from the ideal to the practical. The Indian thought system was the reverse. So we accepted there has to be a limited state. That state should not be all powerful. The state should have legitimacy. And here I want to give one example. The entire Anglo-Saxon law, the Western law, is based on the assumption that the king can do no wrong. You must have read it in common law jurisdiction. But in India you find exactly the reverse. In Ramayana, Rama Pattabhishekam is on, Rama ascends the throne. He looks at Vasishtha and asks him, am I the supreme? Vasishtha takes the Dharmadanda and hits Rama thrice on the head. Dharmadandosi, Dharmadandosi, Dharmadandosi. You are not superior, Dharma is superior. You see not only the philosophical difference, where you position the king, the emperor. Even an emperor like Rama, who was supposed to be beyond all faults. So in the Indian situation, there is a very different philosophy, there is a very different thrust, there is a very different way of handling the state. The state is important, but it is not the most superior. This is very inherent. I am going to deal with how important it is to understand it in the context of the Indian constitution as framed and as it is functioning today. I want to compare how the Indian constitution was framed and how it is working today. I explained to you what is the theory or philosophy of the state. It is a social contract and everybody is bound by that contract. People have surrendered the right to the state and the state can take away the right, suspend the right and kill you people. You can't do anything about it. And that was approved by the Supreme Court in ADM Jabalpur case. I wish all of you go through the judgment to find out how wrong can be the highest judiciary in India. If there is any judgment about which the Supreme Court feels shy today, it is about this judgment. And this judgment follows the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. Now, let us come to the society. After having seen what the state is, how the society produced such a theory. After all, this theory was not produced by few scholars thinking about it. They were observing what was happening in the society. The social process drove these scholars to understand that this is a need. When there was chaos all around, as Kissinger says, people are fighting and killing each other, and there was a central authority which had collapsed. And so some order is needed, some government is needed. So you invest all the powers in the government so that what we call as emergency was always the state in Europe. There was no time of peace. If you read the history of Europe, the one thing you will find is there has never been a year without war. The last 2000 years, there has never been a year without war. And the number of people killed in war and violence, religious and secular, is 100 crores, 1 billion. So in that some state was needed, some law and order was needed. So created this. Why the society became like this? If you look at how the society in the West evolved, the society was a chaotic society. After the Greco-Roman Empire collapsed, there was no order, there was no philosophy except religion. Religion said everybody should obey the Pope, nothing else. And those who did not obey the Pope were declared heretics or killed, or even Joan of Arc was burnt. You know that. She was burnt at stakes. So there was chaos. And this system which 1700 years, 1600 years, this chaos ended when Richelieu, a French cardinal, revolted against the Roman Empire and built the French nation. Many people think it is Protestantism which brought down the Catholic Empire. No, it is the revolt within the Catholics, which French was a Catholic country. And he was the one who first said there is something called French national interest. That was the beginning of nationalism in Europe. Before that, there was nothing called a nation. There was nothing called a state. There is nothing called constitution. There is nothing called rule of law. There is nothing called orderly behavior. And all this was superseded by the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution came, it brought about such a cataclysmic change, a complete uprooting of the society. All the neighborhood societies were disturbed. You must have heard about the poems of Wordsworth. What happened to my carpenter? What happened to my street side vendor? He's not there. I know him for 30 years. We are now all isolated. We are all strewn in different parts of the world. You know, in 1800, the total population of England was 10.5 million. And in 1900, it became 37 million, 75% of them living in towns. And there was absolutely no relationship between them. All the old relationship which was based on their village or their locality got disturbed and everybody became isolated individuals. And so a relation-based society became a contract-based society. This is very, very important if you have to understand the process by which the society changed and law had to change, theory had to change, the relationship between the state and the society had to change. And there were four great thinkers who theorized what is happening. One was Spencer. In 1894 he said, so long we were living in a military society. Some bishop was saying this is how you should behave. Some grandfather was saying this is how you should behave. Father was saying you should. The neighbor was saying this is how you should behave. We were military society and everybody was bound by some senior or the other. Now we have become industrial society. We are a free society today. And in a military society, everything is happening by order, hierarchy. But here everything is by contract, by understanding. People have to live with each other by agreement. And then H.S. Maine, in 1876, about whom I will tell later on the subject of anthropology, he said, status was deciding the society previously, now contract will decide. That is how he made it explicitly a contract-based society, taking cue from the social contract theory of the state. He said the individuals will also deal with each other through the contracts. And then there is one Tonys and Durkheim, about which I will not trouble you because it's a much more deeper issue. All that you have to know now is relationships were substituted by contracts. And there was no relationship between the people and everybody became related only to the state as citizens. There was no other relationship between the people. And this was the beginning of modernity. Modernity means it is a contract-based living. And what is the offshoot of it, we will come to later. Relation to contract, customs to law was the transition. Customs were substituted by law and relationships were substituted by contract. Individualism and contract-based living drove modernity. Modernity meant a free individual. And this started, and what is the end of it, I will tell you in 5 minutes and then go into the anthropological model. It started with saying everybody is a free individual and nobody is bound by any tradition, nobody is bound by any relation, because this is what happened in the West because of the disturbance of the local societies and making them part of a huge mass of urbanization. Today what is the result? They started this process about 120 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, mostly 100 years ago. Today, what you said, the society, there is nothing called society. This is what I will come to later as to how the sociologists began saying. There is nothing called a society. It's only individual. They forgot there is something called family. If the society is not there, the family has also disappeared today. In most of the Western countries, there is no family. In America, 51% of the families are single parent families. This has not happened accidentally. This happened because of a philosophy. Where the husband and wife do not live together. And 41% of the babies born in America are born for unwed mothers. This has not happened accidentally. This happened by a social process. This has happened by constitutional sanction. This has happened by constitution law representing the will of the people. There is no discourse about society in the West. We must know what is a society, no? Society is not an aggregation of the people. Society is the relationship between the people and certain value system. If you remove the value system, there is no society. It is an aggregation of people bound by law, bound by contract, bound by having voting rights, fundamental rights, right to live. Of course, all suspendable by the state. The society disappears if there is no value system. The value system was destroyed. You delegitimize this society. The society doesn't have a structure. The society is a living being. It doesn't have a head. It doesn't have a hierarchy. But it still very much lives. We are all afraid of the society. But what is the society? Society is a very important element in our behavior. It makes us behave well, but there is nothing called society as such. They delegitimize the society through the state laws. With the result, today in America, only 28% of the husband and wife live together with children in their houses. 23% live together without children. 17% live together without marriage. It is 67% in Sweden, which is supposed to be number 2 in Human Development Index. 67% of the men and women live together, anybody with any length of time, and the child born is the property of the state. In Scandinavian countries, your own child is not your child, it is the property of the state, because the family has not only substituted the society, it has substituted the family. So once you break the society, a collection of individuals based on values, it will break right up to the family, and there is no way you can escape this consequence, because this is a social process which has an inevitable conclusion. This is what has happened in the West. There is no use. The West cannot save itself today. You can't ask the Western women, you behave this way. You can't ask the Western man, you should behave this way. Except law. What is it that helps you to behave? Law doesn't help you to behave. This is the point I am coming to next. This is the subject of legal anthropology. How many of you heard this? Legal anthropology? Not even one. Anthropology was a very late entrant in the study of human life. I'll just read out, one of the pithiest legal anthropology comes home, a brief history of the ethnographic study of law. It is freely available. It is a digital commons website at Loyola Marymount University and Loyola Law School. Anthropology is a relative newcomer to the ranks of social sciences. It began to emerge as an autonomous field in the second half of the 19th century. And the name anthropology was used for the first time in 1898. Anthropology is a multidisciplinary study of a society. It evolved. You will be surprised to know anthropology evolved because of two lawyers. One was H.S. Mine. No discipline had greater influence on the birth and growth of anthropology than law. You are all going to be lawyers. Anthropology was developed by lawyers. Some of the first works recognized as anthropology, even before the word anthropology came into being, some of the first works were written by lawyers and dealt with legal topics. In 1861, Sir Henry James Sumner Mayne, you will be surprised to know, he functioned as a law officer in India. His idea about law and society he witnessed in India, and he translated that experience into a text, and the name of the text is Ancient Law. He wrote this based on his Indian experience. An Oxford and Cambridge jurisprudence lecturer who had served as a legal official in India published Ancient Law. He said, Mayne set forth a grand theory to account for the development of law and governance from the origins of human society to his own Victorian England. You must understand, law evolves like that. Law evolves out of the social process. Law cannot evolve independently. For example, the society people indulge in rape. The state has to pass the law. If people are quiet, no law is needed. You must understand, law is not independent of the people and the social functioning. The social process, the value systems, the do's and don'ts, all this ultimately result in law. Be it the constitutional law, which is the overarching law, or a personal law, or public law, everything arises out of the actions of the people. You must have known about the great rule in Hayden's case. Heard about it, no? Rule in Hayden's case is one of the principles of jurisprudence which says why an legal amendment is being passed. A legal amendment is being passed because the existing law contains a lacuna and the people are misusing that lacuna, and so you have to pass a law to plug that lacuna, and the court, while interpreting that amendment, should see it suppresses the mischief and advances the remedy. All this means what? It is the people's actions which result in law. So Mayne's view was how the development of law and governance took place. Mayne made a lasting contribution by identifying a fundamental distinction between societies in which legal rights and responsibilities depend on social status and those which result from contractual arrangement among individuals. This is where he made a distinction between relations, which he called status. Father and mother is a status. Teacher is a status. The local village headman is a status. An elder is a status. Even a neighbor is a status. Because I remember in my village, my neighbor has given me 2 slaps and corrected me. Mothers cannot do it, fathers cannot do it in England and America today. My neighbors have corrected me. My teacher has corrected me. My relatives have corrected me. So there is a huge amount of social process involved in behavior. I am going to come to it how anthropology is related to correcting the behavior of the people rather than punishing the wrong behavior. Then, you must have heard about Morgan Stanley. Have you all heard about it? Morgan Stanley is one of the most important financial firms. And the founder of Morgan Stanley was L.M. Morgan. In 1850s, he took interest in law. He was a businessman. He took interest in law like me. And he became a scholar. He formulated a comprehensive theory of the evolution of human family and ultimately human society itself. As Mayne wrote a book, Ancient Law, he wrote a book, Ancient Society. Published in 1877, analogized stages of human cultural evolution, etc. Morgan divided the cultural history into 3 stages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. We are in the second stage, according to them, barbarism. Even Karl Marx said it is a barbaric society. Why? He gave a very peculiar logic. It's a society which is ununderstandable because in this huge country, people Crores of people move from one end to the other. There is no disturbance. Rivers are maintained properly. The public infrastructure is maintained by the kings. But the economy is organized in villages, and every village is self-contained. They don't need anything from outside. Every producer is a consumer also, so there is mutual dependence. There is no exploitation. But still, this society is a backward society. Because for 2000 years it has not changed. How can a society which does not change can progress? So this most important thing, they are worshipping Hanuman. They are bowing before a cow. These idiots, semi-barbaric people, the British are doing the right thing by destroying the social and economic infrastructure of this society. Though it is a very painful destruction. It is a pleasurable destruction also, because this prepares them for revolution. You can understand this convoluted logic, that without resolution people cannot come up. India has to be prepared for revolution, because otherwise it is living in peace. If somebody is living in peace, you have got to make him peaceless first and then create revolution. This is the Marxian theory. This is what Marx wrote in 1853 on June 23rd in New York Herald Tribune, which is the International Herald Tribune today. And you must access this article and read it to know the most convoluted logic. To say Indians are barbarians because they are worshipping cow. So, these two scholars were the beginners of legal anthropology. But the legal anthropology which these people began and how the West handled it later was a complete perversion. Anthropology was taken over by economics. Instead of studying the society, anthropology began studying economics. With the result, anthropologists began working on what is known as methodological individualism. The social thinkers worked on individualism. The social economists began working on methodological individualism. Methodological individualism's theoretical and practical premise is that ultimately the society is nothing, it is all individuals. I am just going to read out just one sentence from a very famous author called Popper. Popper's methodological individualism was actually a claim about what the world really consisted of. Little more than a fancy way of saying there is no such a thing as society. It is all individuals. You reduce a society, the irreducible minimum is the individual. This he said in 1957. Margaret Thatcher said it in 1973. You must understand this is how lawmakers are influenced by anthropologists and sociologists. They did not study the society. The Western anthropologists did not study the society. They began studying the individuals. And they said the individual's action ultimately decides the social action. So ignore the society and study the individual, because the society was a troublesome affair. They can't give a shape or structure or identity or capacity. You can't file a writ against the society because it has no face. So the difficulty of handling this society made them destroy the society, which resulted in destruction of families, which resulted in destruction of the culture, everything. Values of life, there is no family value today. It is all law, court, lawyers. I'll give you one or two examples. Unless you combine it with practical examples, you cannot understand merely theoretically what's happening. When I was in America in the year 1993, I was in a friend's house and his child was playing with the neighbor's child, volleyball. And he was telling his child, no, ask him to get out and you come inside. I said, only two children are playing. Why are you asking that? There is a Chinese boy who was playing with it. You don't know, you don't think here the situation is like this. If my neighbor's children falls down and gets injured in my compound, he will send me a legal notice for $50,000. If I don't whitewash my building, my neighbor will send a legal notice for $25,000 saying that your building looks ugly, and so because of that my value of my building is going down. And if I don't cut the grass in my compound, he will come and give a notice saying unless you are going to do it, I will ask the corporation to come and do it and send a bill to you. This is the relationship. There is no relationship. So once you started ignoring the society, every other relation became legal and contractual. And that is the premise of their constitution, their law, because it is a collection of individuals without values. And when the West uses the word civil society, don't equate it to our society. It has nothing to do with our society. Many of our intellectuals wrongly use the word civil society to talk about our society. Civil society is something which exists without contracts with each other, but still wants to be in peace with each other. And activist civil society, some Lions Club, Rotary Club, and some NGOs will join together and do something. This is civil society. This is not our society. Our society has a very different meaning. One of my friends, he was driving out of the house. I am talking about 15 years ago. And he was going to attend a meeting of bankers. Very important thing for his business. And as he was driving out to go to the airport, the neighbor's wife came and shouted, "My husband is having chest pain, please come." The man quietly drove the car into the house, put the man in the car, and straight went to the hospital. His bank appointment went up in smokes. He never bothered about it. This is society. You have an implied relationship with everybody. That is why this society functions. You are all brilliant students. How many villages are there in India? Tell me. According to the latest census, total number of villages and towns in this country. 6,68,000 villages and towns in this country. Do you know how many police stations we have? 12,800. In 2001, it was 12,400. Just 400 increase only. And that only in Naxal infected areas. When I mentioned this in UCLA in America, they were stunned. That for so many villages, you have only so many police stations. And when I told them that according to the Human Development Index of the UNDP, which publishes the Human Development Report every year, this is the country with the highest crime rate in the world, serious crimes per 100,000 population, America with 680. And then it keeps on coming down, 500, 400, 300, 200, 100, 50, 20. India is the last with just 4 serious crimes per 100,000 population. You know why? The society controls and regulates the behavior. And that is the study of anthropology I am going to tell you now. The one non-Westerner who started this research was Malinowski, who was born in Poland and educated in London School of Economics. Endowed with prodigious linguistic skills, Malinowski spent World War I living among the Melanesian peoples of the island surrounding New Guinea. He studied their subsistence systems, participated in their rituals. You must know what is anthropology, that's why I am relating this to you. And even accompanied them on some of their dramatic open ocean trading voyages in dugout canoes and published voluminously on every aspect of their, and a misleadingly wrong title he says, The Sexual Life of the Savages of Northwestern Melanesia. The title is not important, the substance of the book is important. Law was among the topics to which Malinowski devoted monograph. In Crime and Custom in Savage Society, in the chapter, he argued that Maine's evolutionary Maine, H.S. Maine, about whom I made a reference, he says Maine's evolutionary scheme rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the governance and social control in so-called primitive societies. Crime and Custom's lasting contribution was to demonstrate convincingly that legal issues are amenable to ethnographic studies. You cannot study law without ethnography, how the society evolves, how the ethnicity evolves. Whereas Maine had written off the members of small and traditional societies as slaves to custom, Malinowski's patient ethnography uncovered a complex set of rules, both civil and criminal, and a subtle system of enforcement. Malinowski's ethnographic insights led him to formulate a legal anthropology's fundamental question. I want all of you to listen to these two sentences very carefully. Then only you can clearly make a distinction between what is the Indian system of, what should have been the Indian system of jurisprudence and what is the Indian system of jurisprudence. Instead of questioning, as Maine might have, whether a society had police or prisons, in crime and customs, for example, Malinowski demonstrated that witchcraft, far from being an extra-legal aberration, was actually a conservative mechanism for discouraging promiscuity and excessive resource consumption. Instead of questioning whether a society had police and prisons, Malinowski asked what behavioral patterns controlled antisocial deviance. The most important thing is to control the deviance of the people into antisocial ways. That is the function of legal anthropology. And he set out that, but in the Western anthropology, the idea of society was not there, because it is the society which controls the deviance. Family controls the deviance. Respect for elders controls the deviance. Respect for teachers controls the deviance. Respect for women controls the deviance. You cannot secure a woman's body through law. It has been demonstrated. In fact, Mr. Vaidya Subramaniam made a reference to the rape law. I waited for 1 month to write the truth, because in that 1 month nobody would have understood if truth was written. You know, one English writer wrote in the Times newspaper, don't believe this Bollywood eulogizing of India as a spiritual nation. They are barbaric people, they have proved it in Delhi. All this spiritualism is a talk. They are still in the semi-barbaric stage. One Yama, within 10 days she wrote an article. Read what this lady says. She thinks rape is taking place only there, and we have gotten it over here. I will give you the statistics. She said England has 3.5 times the population of Delhi. But the number of rapes it has every year is 9,500 against Delhi's 1,600. So how is it that you are superior? Not only that, a rape in Delhi stopped the country for 30 days. This happened in December. In Steubenville, in US, a rape takes place in August. A girl is taken from one party to the other and she was smashed by basketball players. The police won't register the case. The press won't publish it. A blogger put it out in December. A case was filed against him for defamation by the basketball club fans. But after the Delhi rape came out, Wall Street Journal published it in January and the culprits were arrested in February. It doesn't even make a news in our country. And she wrote this article, Emma wrote this article on the 1st of January. On the 10th of January, British Home Office came out with the statistics. What are you saying? Our rape rate is 95,000, total is 95,000 and 9,500? No, it is 95,000. Out of which only 5% people are ever arrested. They don't even face arrest. And the rape in America, which is 1/4 of Indian population, it is 212,000 per year. India 21,000 per year. I am not on the basis of statistics feeling pride. Even if one girl is molested, it is a shame for this country. On the basis of British numbers, India should permit 3.5 million rapes a year. On the basis of American statistics, we should permit 1.6 million rapes per year. But we were projected as a nation of rapists and killers. Why I am mentioning this is, why is it that it is not widespread here? In America, 75% of the rape cases are not reported. It is settled on the spot. Because there is no society. It is just two individuals. Here, father, mother, sisters, surrounding family people, caste people. My caste girl has been raped. Even if the father doesn't want to report it, this village headman will go and report it. This is our respect for women was shown by holding the country to ransom for one whole month. This is anthropology. How the society takes up an issue. And the Burma Committee and all the statements is in response to social action. It is not public opinion. It has travelled beyond public opinion into social action. And so what is important is what controls the behavior of the people. Now I will tell you 4-5 examples and close, because this is very important this is a huge topic. As I told Vaidya Subramaniam, when you asked me to talk on this subject, when I started preparing, I actually prepared a book. Obviously you can't make me read out a book to you. Now, the important point is, an anthropologist looks at a society as to how the society makes the people behave and controls their social deviance. And a person who is purely constitutional and legal, he only thinks of how to punish the deviant. There is no positive element to control the people. Society is needed, family is needed, respect for elders is needed, respect for teachers is needed. But if you make the people that you have nothing to do with any of these people, then only law, courts, lawyers, constitution, parliament, that has to handle. Now I am going to relate to you 4 significant aspects. Take the issue of freedom of faith. Many people think India is a secular country only because of Article 29 and 30. Article 29 and 30 could never have ensured freedom of faith in this country. Jews were strewn all over the world. They were maimed, raped and butchered in 107 out of 108 countries. And the Jewish consulate here, they published a book called Indian Jews in Israel. After 1947, when Jewish state was formed, all the Jews all over the world went to Israel. And it is a story of their book and the Jews who came from India. And it says, the editor of the booklet said, while describing how on the formation of Israel, while most others came to Israel driven by persecution, discrimination, murder, and attempt at total genocide. Now, the other website which I had to tell you was the genocide.com. One I said about religiostolerance.com, next is genocide.com. If you look at both the websites, you will get that 100 crore deaths. So, other attempts at total genocide. The Jews of India came because of their desire to participate in the building of the third Jewish Commonwealth. Throughout their long sojourn in India, the third Jewish sojourn in India, nowhere and at no time they were subjected to intolerance, discrimination or persecution. 2000 years the Jews resided here. There was no Article 29 and 30 to protect them at that time. It is our dharma. It is our attitudinal approach. It is the way we look at another faith. That faith is also as sacred as my faith. This is the creation of the saints and seers in this country. This is a subject of anthropological study. We think the Constitution of India protects other religions. Constitution of India cannot protect. It creates rights and it creates complications. You must make the people behave. That is far more important than creating rights. Cochin Jews arrived 2500 years ago. And I want to read out just through 2-3. When their temple was broken in 70 Common Era, a chieftain by name Joseph Rabban, according to local tradition, was granted a principality for the Jews of Cochin by the Cochin king. When they came there, the Cochin king said, because you have a different way of life, you can't live as part of our society. I will give you an area and I will make you the king of that area. He made him the king. Unfortunately for the Jews of Cochin, Portuguese occupied Cochin in the same period and indulged in persecution of Jews, and they were persecuting them in Europe. Our king gave them a principality, gave them a police, gave them everything to rule, so that they are not molested by others. And these people come there and begin beating them up, killing them. Article 29 was there when the Cochin king gave them this place. This is anthropology. Persecuted by Moors and later Portuguese, many Indian Jews settled in Cochin under the protection of Cheran Perumal, known to Portuguese as the king of Jews. They said, Baba, we don't want any principality. We are living under you. Please protect us. Not because our people troubled them. Their own cousins came from there and killed them. Now I will read the Parsi story to you. A little over 1,000 years ago, this is a book published by the Parsis, the story of Parsis in India. Little over 1,000 years ago, the Parsis landed at Sajjan, a tiny principality ruled by some Jadi Rana. The beleaguered king, not too keen on allowing foreign refugees to settle in his own kingdom, sent a bowl of milk to the foreigners, signifying the land was full and could not support more, because land was the only means. He said, we have enough people, how can we accommodate you? Understanding Jadi Rana's ploy, the leader of the refugees added a pinch of sugar to the bowl, which did not overflow. Jadi Rana understood what he was saying, that we will be like sugar added to milk with you. You know, that is the Parsi community which has produced the tallest industrialists, tallest lawyers, tallest intellectuals, and nobody persecuted them, nobody molested them. They are good-looking people, nobody touches them. Not Article 29 and 30. It is controlling the behavior of the people. It's the thought. It is the society. It is the leaders. It is the elders. It is the sages. It is the saints. The Constitution does not recognize any of these people, but this is real. You understand now? Disciplining the behavior of the people is more important than directing it through law. Minority protection is one of the most important subjects talked about in the world. No country is able to protect the minority. Everybody is being killed. You see, if you see the newspapers, bombings, killings, and don't think I have been tracking the statistics. 9 out of 10 persons killed in mutual violence are Muslims, and among them, the 9 people are not being killed by others. Why? Your version of Islam is not correct, my version of Islam is correct. You understand, it is not one religion that is homogeneous. One God, one text. But the human beings are different. Their tastes are different. Their way of life is different. Why I am saying this is, religion can't ensure peace. There must be a religion which says all religions are true. You know how we did? We produced as many gods as possible, not one God. There was a time in India where we had more gods than the number of people we had. We had 33 crore gods. Our population at the beginning of the last century was only 30 crores. So we made peace between gods, got them married to one another, and saw to it that gods lived in peace. I am not saying this, gods must live in peace, otherwise humans can't live in peace. Is our contribution to the world. Everybody's philosophy, everybody's way of life, everybody's God, everybody's religion is sacred. This thought came here. And this anthropological evolution which resulted in a secular constitution, which the Supreme Court says today. Supreme Court says today that there is secular constitution in India because this country has fostered secular values. That all religions, all gods, all ways of worship are sacred is a thought which has produced this constitution. It has not been created by this constitution. So you see the difference between anthropology and constitution. Next, take the rules of war. I have dealt with freedom of faith and minority. Rules of war. It's one of the most horrendous areas. For the first time only in 1897, by a global agreement, all the countries came to the conclusion that an armed person should not kill an unarmed person. A non-combatant should not be killed. This was the Geneva and Hague Convention. This is what Sweden-based research organization, Swedish Working Group study conventional weapons, their deployment and effects from humanitarian aspects, recommendations for modernization of international law, Stockholm. They are talking about modernization of international law and see what they say. There is evidence that some ancient civilizations prohibited certain methods of warfare. Agreements on the treatment of prisoners of war were concluded in Europe about 1400 BC. Manu law of India prohibited around 500 BC the use of poisoned weapons and other inhumane methods. Encyclopedia Britannica says in early history, war appears to have been the most unrelieved form of barbarity. Practically no restraints were observed in methods of war. There was little discrimination between combatant and non-combatant, torture, slavery, death, confiscation of property awaited the forces and the population. Now I am going to tell you three things. What is the rule of war in India? Rigveda says, do not poison the tip of your arrow, do not attack sick or old, do not attack child or woman, do not attack from behind. In Mahabharata, it lists certain rules of war agreed between combating sides, such as one should fight only someone similarly equipped. One should not kill a soldier who is already in combat with another, or who has turned his back from fight, or without armor. Some of these will fare now. This is Mahabharata times. Some of these will fare comparison with the Geneva and Hague Conventions. Forbidden actions in war are killing anyone who has lost his horse, charioteer or weapons, turns away from the battle, sits down, climbs a tree in flight. This is Gautama's rule of war. One should not fight with a treacherous weapon or barbed or poisoned weapons, weapons pointing to blazing fire, not fight with one who runs away. Completely. The wars were divided into three categories. Victories. Dharma Vijaya, Lobha Vijaya, Asura Vijaya. Don't think this I am saying, this is what A.L. Basham says. I am going to read out to you. It will be hair-raising to you as to how we fought wars. When there was no international convention, unilaterally. A.L. Basham says, War Ethics of Hindu India, unparalleled, says A.L. Basham. In the introduction to his work, Wonder That Was India, A.L. Basham says, after severely criticizing India for various things, naturally they have to do it. Yet overall impression is that in no part of the world were the relationship of man and of man to the state so fair and humane. In no other civilization where slaves were so few in number. And in no other ancient law book are the fights so well protected as in Arthashastra, or rights so protected as in Arthashastra. No other ancient lawgiver proclaimed such noble ideals as fair play in battles. In a history of warfare, Hindu India has very few tales to tell of cities put to sword or massacre of non-combatants, etc. I will conclude this part with how victory was classified. Dharma Vijaya, Lobha Vijaya, Asura Vijaya. Righteous victory, lustful victory, barbaric victory. In rightful victory, you ask the other person, please accept me as your superior. I am the Chakravarti. If you have accepted me as the superior, I don't have to fight with you. In lustful victory, you have a war, conquer and annex his territory. But in barbaric victory, you annex his wife, his children, his money, everything. Basham says the third category of war was never practiced in India. The first two category of wars were never practiced outside India. And Chanakya said, because Chanakya had come in contact with the Greek and Roman people, he felt this Dharma Vijaya concept won't work. He said we should follow this Lobha Vijaya, lustful victory. We should annex territories, otherwise we can't build empire. In fact, A.L. Basham says Indians could not build the empire only because they were following noble concept of war. You know, if you win a war and defeat a king, you are supposed to hand over the kingdom back to him. You can't annex it, you can't put your brother-in-law. And if that fellow doesn't want to be the king again out of shame, you have to appoint someone from the same vamsha. If nobody is willing to come, he has to call a sabha of the people and say, please tell us who will protect your culture, we will appoint him as the king. How can these people build empires? So A.L. Basham says, it is the noble concept of war practiced by this civilization which was a deterrent against building empires. So, in Arthashastra, Chanakya said, no, this won't work because another different kind of laws are prevalent somewhere. You should follow Lobha Vijaya. And Chanakya became a very powerful thinker and he built an empire, you know. The entire Mauryan kingdom was built by him. See how Chanakya was dealt with by our famous intellectuals. You will be stunned to know there was one Kadambari Bana of the 7th century. He wrote a treatise saying this Chanakya is a rascal. He is promoting adharma and so he should be shunned. Not a single copy of Arthashastra was left. It was all burnt in northern India. Because he thought of Lobha Vijaya. One copy escaped. That was with the Mysore King's library. And that is why we have Arthashastra. Because Kadambari Bana attacked this man so badly. But this man was only saying, Baba, you may practice this. Others are not practicing this. So you must have another kind of warfare. Our own law permits that you can have this kind of warfare. And throughout history, if you see how the enemies attacked us, they will first bring 1,000 cows. You will not kill the cows. They will kill the cows and you also. This has happened many times. So Chhatrapati Shivaji changed the concept of war and he won. Because he went into the second mode of war. Now I am going to read out to you one part which will complete the discussion. In the history of Kerala by Padmanabha Menon, the war models adopted in the distant Malabar Peninsular India, it is not that it was practiced only 500 years ago, 1000 years ago. This is in the 17th century. And the Mohammedan king wrote a letter to the Portuguese that this is how we generally fight. You know, we will beat the drum in the morning and you will also beat the drum. So both sides are ready for war. And we will beat the drum in the evening, you will also beat the drum, the war will close. And the war should be in the playground outside the towns and cities. Agriculture should not be affected, trade should not be affected, education institutions should not be affected. Then the Portuguese asked, this man is asking for war or sports? When they are in battle and one army is distant from the two others, ranges of crossing bow, the king said to the Brahmin, go to the camp of the enemy and tell the king to let 100 of his soldiers to come and I will send 100 of mine. Why we should allow 30,000 to clash with each other? First you send 100, I will send 100. Let them fight. Let us assume I am defeated. Maybe at that point I may accept why kill the others. And then go to the middle space and begin fight. And they fight for 3 days. And always give direct blows on the head and all that. Afterwards, if they are, one side is defeated, we can send another 1,000 from this side and 1,000 from that side. Maybe at that point we can have peace. The idea in war is to avoid war. Does your legal system recognize this anthropological model? Which was practiced as late as 17th century. And it says, Whiteway, who wrote a book from which the author, Padmanabha Menon, quotes, he says, Whiteway in his work on the rise of Portuguese power in India, after explaining how wars were fought in Kerala on noble principles, says, confronted by the Portuguese war model, the noble war model was given up by the indigenous kings. What Chanakya said 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, the Mauryan kings had to do it in 1700. This artificial system, he says, Whiteway says this is artificial system because it is from his perspective. Quickly came under stress of fighting against the Portuguese. Thus it had always been the custom of the Zomari to sound the trumpet, that it took 4 men to lift to warn the enemy of an intended attack. I am going to attack you. The man beats the drum. He nearly surprised the Portuguese by abandoning the custom suddenly and attacking him surprisingly. You know, the element of dharma is the enemy should never be taken by surprise by your attack. Can you find a more noble war model, not only conceptualized but practiced? Are you ever thought about it? And this is one of the biggest subjects of international law from 1897. What you are learning about Indian society, Indian law, Indian way of thinking is ridiculously minimal or nothing. And now I will come to social security. With that I close my subject. Because of this individualism, what has happened? Now, in America, 51% of the families, households are dependent on the government because they are single parent families. The unemployed people are looked after by the government. The elderly people are looked after by the government. The infirm people are looked after by the government. The family looks after nobody because there is no family. The families have been destroyed. And the state has taken over the families. The state destroyed the society first, and then the families were destroyed. And the state has to take over the family functions. And the families have been nationalized. And the government is being privatized. Water supply, roads, bridges. This is a clear anthropological evolution in the West. This is the economic model which has forced the social model, and it has resulted in a constitutional model. It is the social functioning. But in India, all of you know your parents are bringing you up, they are investing in you, you owe an obligation to them. You may read the law and constitution and society of the West, but you are going to be only the son or daughter of your parents. Because of that, in India, it is the family which looks after the parents, elders, infirm people, unemployed people. There are 6 crore unemployed people in India. Who is looking after them? Families. Elderly people, infirm people. Who is looking after them? Family. It is reality. If all earning Indians decide to disown their parents, what will happen to them? Can the government of India give 2 square meals a day? The entire budget will not be adequate to give them 2 square meals to about 70 crore people. This is the relationship. You turn it into contracts, it's over. The study of the relationship is sustains the society, which creates a way of life. It sustains the economy, and it sustains the states, and which avoids policing, because the society is policing, family is policing, elders are policing, teachers are policing. This replaces law, because it handles the behavior of the people. This is the function of anthropological law. This is not the law which is anthropological legal studies in the West. Because the anthropological legal studies in the West have become individualism based, and because of methodological individualism and the absence of state, absence of family, it is the individual and the state, and right now it is now allowing man and man to marry, woman and man to marry, woman and woman to marry. You can understand how chaotic it has become. A family based society will never allow it. And that is the society we live in. And that's how our character is shaped, thinking is shaped, behavior is shaped. This element has to be recognized so that you don't disturb this function. Now, Domestic Violence Act has come. You know, every husband and wife have clashes. I have seen wife beating husband also because it's all family disputes. Like women rape men in the West. 1/10 of the rape is by women on men. Because they are equal. No? They are yet to become equal. Another 40% they have to bridge. What I am saying is, there is an intense moment in which because the more intense relationship you share, the more intense the hatred becomes at a point in time. You bring the policeman inside, what will happen to the family? The family is over. This is what the West did. And you pass such a law and say it is progressive law, destroy families. Law can destroy families, it can't create. It can destroy societies, it can't create. Because these are evolutions of cultural anthropology. I am very happy. It's a very tough subject to handle. And you all listen to this tough subject. And it is not that our thinkers did not think of it. I am going to read out to you a paragraph from Srimad Bhagavatam. You know Kamsa was a tyrant who killed all the children of... He was hated. So he approached a very intelligent and a wise man called Bahuka, who was the advisor of his father-in-law. Jarasandha was the father-in-law of Kamsa. And so Kamsa approached Bahuka. Please tell me, all these people hate me. How to make them like me? You can't make them like you. That is definite. Because they only respect sages. Do you mean to say, I have no answer? You have no answer for me? He said, mighty prince, there is only one way to destroy the sages, whom the people worship. Open your purse strings to the people. You empty the khazana of the government. Give to the people whatever they want. Teach them to eat, drink and enjoy themselves. Break up their families. Teach women that chastity is not worth having at the cost of pleasure. Bring up children to look upon their parents as old and useless. Once people begin to believe in unrestrained pleasures as the goal of life, they will look upon these ascetics as deranged and will laugh at those who talk of duty, love and compassion. And once you achieve it, whatever you do, they will bear as patiently as uncomplaining bees and obey your lash as if it is a favor from you. You destroy the self-respect of people, the mutual affection between the people, relationship between the people, then they will be dependent on you. This is the economics America has practiced today, because no American parent is dependent on the son, they are dependent on the state. No American son or daughter is dependent on the father, they are dependent on the state. They have destroyed all mutual relationship. And the state has emerged as the sole dispenser of favors. Produced a state-dependent population by law and contract. The issue is whether such a large country as 120 crore people, which is 4 times the population of America, which is 20 times the population of Germany, 24 times the population of England, which is 150 times the population of Sweden, 200 times the population of Norway. Can a government dispense it? Can't. But the lawmakers are forcing such changes on the society that unless the society is vigilant, unless intelligent people guard the society against this trespassing nature of the government, lawmakers, parliament, media, intellectuals, particularly the English-speaking intellectuals, we are at great risk in the next 50 years. And I thought I must make this presentation before you. Thank you very much.